Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir. My name is Jackie Clark, and I'm the president of the Society for the Study of French History, which is one of the two organizations sponsoring this event, along with our colleagues in the Association for the Study of Modern and Contemporary France. As our name suggests, we try to support lots of activities that support the study of French history. And one of those is that we give an annual undergraduate dissertation prize. And it is our tradition to announce the winner of that prize at this event. Unfortunately, this year's winner cannot be here, but I think we can still give her her moment of glory by announcing her name in this forum. So this year's winner is Sofia Panurgios. I suppose I should put my glasses on for this bit, actually, from the University of Oxford for her dissertation entitled Que la femme choisisse, Bodily Autonomy in the Fight for Contraception and Abortion Across Francophone Mobilizations, 1964 to 1980. And I will also just give an honourable mention to two runners-up, both from the University of Edinburgh, Hector Leluel and Alice Fagan. I'm guessing she's an Alice and not an Alice, but I'm not sure. I'm sorry that they can't be with us tonight, but I think we can give them a round of applause in absentia. And without further ado, I'll hand you over to Professor Marisa Linton to introduce our speaker.
Okay. I just want to say well done for coming. Sorry, can you hear me properly? That's better, isn't it? Well done for coming out on this cold January evening to hear a talk on history. You're in for something, I think, really special tonight, really exciting. So well done for coming. So it's my pleasure to introduce for the, 26th, I think. Yes? 26th Annual Douglas Johnson Memorial Lecture. Is it? I looked it up. 26th. Looked it up. Has to be true. Okay, sorry. 26th Annual Douglas Johnson Memorial Lecture. So the person who's giving that tonight is here, thankfully. It would be a shame if you weren't. So this is Professor Renaud Morieux. He is a professor of European history at the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on oceans, borders, the social history of war and migrations between the 18th century and the present. He's currently working on the effects of war and forced mobility on trans-imperial families, with a particular focus on the Indian Ocean. His books include The Channel, England, France, and the Construction of a Maritime Border in the 18th Century. That was with Cambridge University Press in 2016. And The Society of Prisoners, Anglo-French Wars and Incarceration in the 18th Century. And that was with Oxford University Press in 2019. And the subject of his talk tonight is Dislocated Families, Women, War and Migrations in French India during the Age of Revolution. He will talk to you, well, for as long as he pleases, really, and within reason, and then we'll go on to some very relaxed questions, and it will be great to hear what people think and what you have to ask. So if you just all join me in welcoming him. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Marisa, for this very kind introduction. Welcome, everyone, mesdames et messieurs. That's going to be the only two words in French probably tonight. Ladies and gentlemen. So I'll start by thanking the Society for the Study of French History, as well as the Modern Contemporary France Society, and the Institut Français. I'm really pleased and honored to be allowed to speak to you tonight. And I'll start immediately. I don't know, can I use this for the slides? We'll see. I'll try in a second. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, all good. So I'll start by giving you a bit of context because the lecture is focusing on a part of the world that not everyone is familiar with. I'll wait because cognitive dissonance. Between the second half of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, the so-called Age of Revolutions, the Indian Ocean became one of the principal theaters of the global war waged by European imperial states. Some key protagonists were the East India companies. These chartered and joint stock enterprises, partially state-owned and partially private, fought for trade monopolies. The French Compagnie des Indes Orientales not only had trading settlements and military forts in Île Bourbon, Réunion, and Île-de-France, Mauritius, the so-called Mascarene Islands, but also along the Indian coasts in Calicut. So it's the blue dots here, the French so-called comptoir. In Calicut, Yanao, Mahé, Chandernagore, or Pondicherry. With a population of about 60,000 people in 1791, Pondicherry was the largest French possession in Asia. It had been highly contested by other powers since its establishment in 1673. It was besieged and destroyed several times by the British in the 18th century. This trading port was connected to the Indian Ocean and the rest of the world, and its population was highly mobile. The French Compagnie des Indes was dissolved, was liquidated in 1793, and the main player by this time was the British East India Company, which began to morph into a political, military, and territorial power. So conflicts in the Indian Ocean in this period were in part spillouts of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which would pit Britain, France, and the respective allies against one another for more than 2 decades. A former British Secretary of War called Sir George Young stated in 1800 from the Cape, the French, which had then become a British colony as well, the French are spreading Jacobinism all over India. Even their manufactures are emblematical and tend to excite the natives to rebellion. I'll send you a sample from Bordeaux. So this kind of conspirational thinking spread alongside British armies and navies. These wars also, of course, involved local rulers and populations. The Fourth Anglo-Mysore War thus opposed Britain and the sovereign of Mysore, Tipu Sultan, who cultivated friendly relationships with the French Directoire. So in the wake of imperial wars, while many men were fighting against or for European armies, thousands of civilians, European as well as indigenous people, were left distressed in the Indian subcontinent. When their cities and villages were occupied by foreign armies, widows, workers, poor people, elderly men and women, disabled and mentally ill, faced unemployment, inflation, and the breakdown of structures of charity and private networks of assistance. European soldiers in India who served in various armies, not just European armies, but also for Indian states as mercenaries, have typically been described as adventurers, aventuriers. By contrast, the experience of their wives, mothers, and daughters seems to be a story of stasis. So what really happened to the women in the absence of men? Did they spend their time anxiously waiting for the hypothetical return of their husbands and sons? They have often been overlooked, perhaps because their lives seem less eventful. In fact, in peacetime, it wasn't uncommon for husbands to be absent. For seamen or soldiers, this was even a structural issue, leading historians to describe their wives as occupational widows. And this became an endemic phenomenon in wartime. Many women survived their husbands, died in battle or disease or old age. But many others didn't know what had happened to their male partners. These women were not exactly like typical widows. Their husbands had disappeared, but they were not necessarily dead, which created legal and economic complications for them. Take the case of the ladies La Tuileries and d'Egmont, two sisters living in Pondicherry. Their husbands, respectively a lieutenant in the French Navy and an army officer with the Compagnie des Indes, had returned to France in 1792, where they were said to be still alive at the end of 1807. So the two sisters lived alone with their 80-year-old mother and their children for more than 15 years. Gross widows is a term that began to be used in the early 19th century to designate those women whose husbands were away, sometimes for very long periods. In the meantime, their wives were put out to grass like old discarded horses. At least this is where the expression comes from. It is obviously problematic. It's an ugly expression, especially if it implies leisurely freedom. And migration studies often overlook the fact that migrants moved back and forth between places. The migration studies also tend to focus primarily on those who move and ignore those who stay. And the focus tends to be on men rather and less about women. So in the following lecture, I focus on these women and their dislocated, fragmented, or broken families. Families were dislocated in two ways. They were stretched and they were scattered, often across large distances. How did family members, and especially women, adapt to separation and spatial disconnection? Did they leave their homes or stay put? If they moved away, did they ever return? In short, what were their survival strategies? Every economy depends on care work, whether that is paid or not. It involves reproductive labor, services, and looking after the young, the ill, the disabled. And care work is mainly performed by women, but not only by them. In wartime, when the men who did paid work were absent, the women struggled to survive, because much of the work they did was unwaged. They needed to find alternative sources of income, and remarrying, while not impossible, was rarely an option. In French India, it wasn't just poorer women who struggled, but their wealthier counterparts as well. In fact, pretty much everyone needed support. Formerly well-off individuals often suffered a downward social mobility and experienced poverty for the first time, which was precipitated by widowhood or separation. So in the French Indian settlements, philanthropic policies had long been in place, in particular for orphan children and widows of the Compagnie des Indes employees. In July 1793, the city was attacked by the armies of the East India Company. So 1793 is the beginning of the wars between Britain and France in Europe, February 1793, and it has consequences across the world. So the city is attacked and capitulates a month later, in August 1793. And Pondicherry would remain under British occupation until 1816. During this entire period, a pension system was established by the British. Initially, it was only supposed to replace the Compagnie des Indes by taking care of its civil and military employees, but by 1795, a British administrator noted that, I quote, "sundry French persons resident at Pondicherry were benefiting from the company's allowances." And the cost of this measure and its viability in the long term were already raised at this time. A decade later, so we are at the beginning of the 19th century, pensions and allowances were still being awarded to the French inhabitants, even though various committees were advising to discontinue them. So in British India, before the invasion of Pondicherry, comparable schemes had been set up by the East India Company for other groups. For instance, indigenous women who married or lived in concubinage with East India Company soldiers were granted relief. And the regulation of family relations was rooted in a belief in the paternal responsibility to the families once they had lost their male protectors. As explained by Derber Ghosh, this discourse also contributed to legitimizing the rule of the East India Company. The East India Company also granted pensions to the families and servants of Indian sovereigns, including those of its defeated enemies. And these dynastic policies, politics, as shown by Margot Finn, were inseparable from military issues. But the individuals I study, I'm going to flesh it out and talk about real people in a minute. The individuals I focus on today were neither British nor British subjects. They didn't belong to the families of Indian princes either. So why would the East India Company, the British East India Company, care about and for them? So this is George Annesley, the second Earl of Mount Norris, who visited Pondicherry in February 1804. In his travelogue, he described the effect that the British occupation had had on its inhabitants, praising the invaders for their humanity, that's the term he used, towards, I quote, the respectable families. The key word here is, of course, respectable. This generosity wasn't supposed to be lavished on every French man and woman. In these years, the imperial state was torn between humanitarian, security, and economic imperatives. The cost of this liberality never ceased to worry company officials. For for the British state, which was obsessed with cutting down on expenses in those years, both at home and in the empire, the notion that governments would become, and I quote an expression I found in the archives, distributors of charities, was repulsive. This language was very common in England as well at the time. Poor law officials, for instance, worried that the poor were overpaid. So given the prevalence of this principle of thrift, the continuation of these pensions begs explaining. Why would, again, the British support foreign civilians, subjects of their present or former enemies, living in their midst? And this wasn't specific to French India. Similar practices took part in former Dutch and Danish colonies invaded following the British takeover. The company's charitable endeavors in India have been described as manifestations of the British claims to moral superiority. But these policies of care were also folded into broader military aims, which entailed preventing social unrest, coercing colonized populations, forcefully putting them to work, and regulating their sexuality. Now, to request financial support, women wrote letters and petitions to colonial officials, usually in French, which were translated by the East India Company. And these letters are kept mostly in the British Library in London, which is very convenient for me. The vast majority of these women were Catholics, born in India, and often had at least one Indian parent, while most of their partners were born in Europe. And in their appeals to the authorities, the writers presented stories that they hoped would elicit a specific outcome on the part of a sympathetic colonial official, like some people do. I won't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it. But like the victims of theft or arson or storms might exaggerate their misfortunes in order to claim more money from the insurance companies today. And these letters contained elements of rhetorical strategy, shown by the repetition of the same tropes. Many referred, for instance, to suffering induced by war. But this doesn't mean that we should read these requests in terms of disingenuity or cheating. No two letters were identical. Besides their content, it is also what these letters did that interests me. The most successful petitions and letters managed to strike a chord. So historians have long emphasized the moment of widowhood as liberating, with the creation of new opportunities. By contrast, more recent approaches have underlined the fragility of widows. For poor widows, the worst scenario was social and economic isolation. Jeanne Lisset had married Jérôme Gabis in Pondicherry in April 1787. Jérôme died while a prisoner of war in British Calcutta in 1802, leaving her with no property, a son aged 12, and little prospect of remarriage. In 1808, she wrote a petition to the British magistrate. So I've just highlighted a few significant terms here, but what matters is the language of deference, which was tailored to the gendered nature of the exchange. Typically, women writing to men imbued with authority presented themselves as defenseless and helpless. And Jeanne here described herself as a victim. You see the term distressed in yellow twice. You see the term obliged twice, persecuted. And the debts she contracted were not a sign of her moral failings, but of her misfortune in this self-presentation. And again, one can draw inspiration from historians working on paupers in Britain or France. What we've learned from historians of the poor law in Britain has parallels in India. Widows in Britain favored two rhetorical strategies in their letters to poor law officials. They underlined their social worth, often using the same language as parish officials who liked the humble and deserving poor. These are the terms that they used, not mine. And they emphasized their moral claims to relief, not simply by being widows, but by acting, by doing. They described how they tried to find work or resources, which was a way to show their respectability. Jeanne's request was successful, so she was granted 12 rupees per month in 1809, but she didn't live very long to enjoy it. She died 2 years after writing this letter. She was 52, and only gravediggers attended her burial. You see the sentence here, ont assisté à son enterrement les fossoyeurs de la dite paroisse qui ont déclaré ne savoir signer. And this is the Capucin Cemetery in Pondicherry, where she probably is buried. In Pondicherry, the word soon got around that people were getting helped by the East India Company, which gave rise to a sense of entitlement based on concepts of comparative justice and precedent. The widow Makono, whose husband had died in 1806 at 85, was an indigent woman with 2 daughters unprovided for. She wrote to the English magistrate in Pondicherry and resorted to pathos, mentioning a dreadful situation, which had reduced her, and I quote, to the utmost extremity of misery. Her letter also conveys her expectations that the addressee would do her justice. You have never ceased, sir, during your residence in this town, to do all the good in your power to those who have recommended themselves to you. And I am, I believe, the only person who has unfortunately been left out. I know not by what fatality. And this petition ended with a promise of prayers to God for the prolongation of your precious life, she wrote. And so what it tells us is that it wasn't just a top-down interaction. The intercession of the British official would be rewarded, if not with her prayers. Through her prayers, even if she couldn't reciprocate and give him much, she would pray for him, and so if not in this world, her gratitude would entitle him maybe to a better treatment in the next. Thanks to the mediation of this magistrate, again, the company increased her allowance. In Western Europe, widows were often described as the embodiment of the deserving poor. This was also the case in the colonies. Christian theology emphasized generosity to the honorable poor, and specifically widows as Christian duty. Those people, like the petitioners I just mentioned, who were elderly and whose husband's death had thrown into poverty, tended to be given higher levels of relief. On 30th of December 1808, Céleste Bouchez wrote to the governor-in-council in Madras, British. Since the death of her father, 20 years before, Céleste had been depending on his pension, which had been passed on to her mother by the French monarchy and then the East India Company. This wasn't sufficient, explained Céleste, since, I quote, the infirmities of age have fallen on my mother. She added, I experienced the cruel affliction of being unable either to assist her in her distress or to be in any manner serviceable to her in her old age, being myself far advanced in life, a valetudinarian and infirm. Elder care and end-of-life care was usually provided at home by other members of the family. This is an example of what Alex Shepard calls the care burden. Contemporary societies are familiar with this phenomenon. The older people get, the less able they are to sustain themselves through work, while the degradation of their health increases their financial needs. Celeste and her mother were granted a pension, but after her mother died in 1812, Celeste was left with unpaid debts, and so she applied for a continuation of that pension. And this is really the phenomenon that happened to many others. As years went by and the families aged, these pensions represented a huge proportion of their income. The East India Company expected that these pensions would terminate at the death of the beneficiaries to avoid creating what we would call or what some would call structural dependence on state relief. In reality, on the death of the beneficiaries, descendants claimed the pensions, not just wives, but also children and sometimes grandchildren and others. Instead of diminishing, the number of beneficiaries increased with time. When a pension lapsed in 1807, no less than 6 memorials were addressed to the Madras government by different individuals to claim its succession. And the need for support was real. In June 1808, a report mentions 200 applications in Pondicherry. And the colonial officials who commented, summarized, and forwarded these letters to their superiors were usually sympathetic to these pleas. They invoked their pride in what they called national humanity. That's the term that I found in the archives. Bringing relief to the distressed, destitute, and deserving victims of war was, according to this view, among the duties of the conquerors towards the conquered. But as mentioned, this principle always clashed with economic concerns. So far, I've considered women who stayed in Pondicherry and applied for relief after their husband's disappearance. But some families resorted to a different survival strategy. They deliberately fragmented to be eligible for state support, with the aim of reuniting whenever possible. Historians have shown that married soldiers, often in Britain, for instance, chose to enlist in the army and leave their households to enable their wives to claim poor relief. And in the same way, instead of thinking about the husbands necessarily as abandoning their families, their departure might have been the result of a planned strategy, a family strategy. In this sense, spatial dislocation wasn't only imposed from above. So you have to, again, project yourself in 1790s and 1800s India. The circumstances of war didn't always make it easy or possible for a family to travel together. And in the meantime, it was usually the role of women to keep the household together. In 1808, Marie Morancy was 37 years old. She was born in Mauritius of French-born parents. She had married Achille de Saint-Quentin in 1789 when she was 18 and he was 33. They had 6 children together. The first 2 boys were born in Mauritius. The 4 youngest children, 1 boy and 3 daughters, were born in Pondicherry. And when she wrote to the East India Company in 1808, an unfortunate series of events had made her situation, to quote her letter, wretched and imperiled the lives of her children. Marie's predicament originated in the decision of the East India Company to restrict the number of beneficiaries of its financial support. So this family had received a pension since the British invasion in 1793. But in 1807, the company gave them the choice between remaining at Pondicherry without any allowance or boarding a ship sent to the Île-de-France, to Mauritius. So Achille, the husband, a captain of artillery, chose to embark to Mauritius. And Marie remained behind in Pondicherry with the children. She was given an allowance for 6 months and was enjoined to go to the Île-de-France by the earliest opportunity. Time lapsed and no opportunity presented itself, leaving her destitute and forced to live on credit. At this time, there were very few ships traveling between French India and the Mascarene Islands. There were merchant ships and especially smuggling ships, and it was costly and difficult. On the other hand, the nearby neutral Danish settlement of Tranquebar continued to trade with French ports in the Western Indian Ocean. And so when an opportunity arose, Marie took a radical decision. When she heard that there was at Tranquebar a vessel bound to the Île-de-France, she proceeded to go there with her 3 children. So Tranquebar is the red dot, and you see it's very close to Pondicherry. It's only 120 kilometers. But it seems like nothing, but going from Pondicherry to Tranquebar with 3 young children, she had 3 daughters at this time with her, age 11, 6, and 5, must have been extremely difficult psychologically and financially. She had to pack up all her belongings and take to the road in a hurry. Rumor, urgency, and war hazards determined her decision. Unfortunately, her timing couldn't have been worse. Her plans were dashed by the British capture of Tranquebar in February 1808, putting an end to Denmark's neutrality and its colonies. So there was now no prospect for her to make a living in the former Danish settlement, where, I quote her letter, she had no friends. Marie returned to Pondicherry. Since the departure of her husband, she wrote, a friend had helped her, but, quote, a very confined allowance do not permit her any longer to afford me assistance. The mention of friends here evokes the reliance of these isolated women on networks of care, such as neighbors or extended families. Marie was eventually granted an allowance until she could join her husband in Mauritius, an extension, which she did at some unknown date. At last, the family was reunited. At last, happy end. But no, because Achille died in April 1810, and in December, Britain invaded Mauritius. Marie stayed in Mauritius while her daughters were growing up. She was granted a pension from the British governor there. And then years passed by, and the money wasn't sufficient for her family. So in 1814, she returned to Pondicherry. After the Napoleonic Wars, when Pondicherry was restored to France in 1816, Tranquebar returned to Denmark, Cochin and Ceylon to Holland, the East India Company received a lot of applications from French, Danish, Dutch women asking for their pensions to be continued. Most of them were now unsuccessful, as was the case for Marie. So after this, I haven't managed to track her down, but I know she died in British India, in Calcutta, in 1824. So the case of Marie shows the impact of inter-imperial wars on families that lived global lives. Marie was able to relocate her family across large expanses of space. She crossed the Indian Ocean at least 3 times, in addition to moving across the subcontinent. To get from A to B, people didn't always take direct routes. They followed convoluted itineraries, partly dictated by the situation of war, but these itineraries were not random either. They typically joined family members or someone they knew. And we also note that immobility and mobility were not mutually exclusive. In all these years, Marie remained the central node in a family that was stretched by challenges of war, but never completely torn apart, thanks to her success in obtaining pensions from various authorities in different places. Maria da Costa was the widow of Nicolas da Costa, who had been employed as bookkeeper and accountant in the French service at Pondicherry for 50 years. The da Costa were taupas. It's a term that designates descendants of Portuguese settlers in India, who were Catholic and retained some European cultural habits, such as their clothes, but had a mixed racial ancestry. Nicolas da Costa was a native of Chandernagore in Bengal, while Maria was born in Pondicherry. So what happens to this family is that Nicolas' colleagues, after the British takeover of Pondicherry, obtained a continuation of their pay. But Nicolas, who had been the oldest servant, didn't get a pension. So after he died, Maria tried to obtain reparation for this oversight. And and in the meantime, they really suffered from awful poverty. Nicholas was forced, before dying, in the last 3 years before dying, he had to sell all his property and even his ceremonial clothes. Misery and grief, wrote Maria, eventually led to Nicholas' death, leaving his family totally destitute. She applied to the Roman Catholic Church at Pondicherry for charity, but she got a pittance, 11 rupees per month, with a teeny sum from the East India Company, which wasn't sufficient to survive. And because the magistrates of Pondicherry, to which she wrote, were not ready to increase her pension, she took more drastic steps. She opted to go to Madras, 100 in Chennai today, 166 kilometers away, to plead her case in person with the governor. The magistrate of Pondicherry, the British magistrate, apologized in a letter to his superiors for failing to deal with her locally, to dissuade her from bothering him. In fact, Maria used a tactic favored by women from the popular classes in Europe who visited poor law officials in person or went to parliamentary sessions to make themselves heard. These women relied on what has been called their importunity, or to use a contemporary term, their pester power, like children in the supermarket who keeps asking us to buy something for them. Maria went further to put more pressure on the British authorities. She took her numerous family with her. The British magistrate in Pondicherry, called Fallowfield, who was accustomed to dealing with written and indirect requests, was taken aback, and he struggled to make sense of this behavior. Why would she, he wrote, incur such a considerable and unnecessary expense and go to Madras? He didn't doubt the veracity of her claims, but he stopped short of describing her as respectable. He said her character was beyond reproach, and it was attested by persons of respectability. But her desperate actions would set a bad example. Indigent individuals might want to imitate her, and also, like her, go to Madras in person to solicit relief. In the end, though, he couldn't prevent her from going. Because of the gendered nature of mobility control in India at the time, where only men were required to have a passport to move around, not women. So Maria wasn't granted a larger pension, unfortunately. And company officials went into great details to explain that this trifling amount should be sufficient for this family, in terms that I haven't encountered for other women. Fallowfield, the magistrate, emphasized, I quote, the comparative cheapness of the cost of essential articles of life in Pondicherry, such as fish, wood, oil, fruit, vegetables, etc. He added that her daughters would easily find work in the textile industry, in the manufacture of stockings and lace, a manufacture that also employed young children at the time. Overall, he downplayed the challenges of making ends meet with such meager resources. And perhaps as a consequence of Maria's actions, the company endeavored to change its policy. In June 1808, Fallowfield reflected on the situation that had gotten out of control, stating, I quote, that the greatest part, if not the whole of the Europeans in distressed circumstances, were receiving some support or another from the company. He was concerned that this trend would encourage non-eligible people to apply to protection from government. The numerous families of Misties and Topazes, or people of color which reside in Pondicherry, shouldn't expect to be given the same provisions as those he called the real French. This official thus required to be given discretionary latitude to block any application. Historians have shown that the status of native women and mixed-race children in particular was a constant source of anxiety for European empires. In this period, in the French Empire, as well as in the British Empire, colonial hierarchies were consolidated by a kind of essentialization of distinctions between Europeans on the one hand and natives so-called natives on the other, and race was a key factor in women's chances to be allocated pensions and allowances. Now, the East India Company wasn't just trying to alleviate, of course, I hope it's clear from what precedes, to alleviate the pain of these unfortunate women who had been left alone by their husbands. It actually played a more active part in their ordeal. In fact, not everyone left Pondicherry willingly. In the 1790s, the company removed from the settlement troublesome male inhabitants and sent them to Europe. This decision to get rid of political enemies was quite literally a project of social, temporal, and spatial disconnection. In 1798, Richard Wellesley, Governor General of the British Possessions in India, expressed his fear, quote, that the strongest and boldest spirit of Jacobinism prevails in the subcontinent. And so in 1799, the East India Company put 600 Frenchmen, of whom 52 were civilians from Pondicherry, on board a ship sailing to Europe by way of the Cape of Good Hope and St. Helena. Most of the civilians on board this ship were described as plotters, and all of them were described as plotters, but most of them were in relationships with local women. And this breakup of families was justified by the concern with sexual, moral, and political disorder. It was common practice in British India before even the invasion of Pondicherry. After the invasion of Danish settlements, similar measures were taken after the capture of Pondicherry. However, again, and that's the term that you find in the archives of the East India Company, human considerations to the families, pensions and allowances were distributed. So there's a tension here. On the one hand, you've got a state that deports the men, and on the other, the same state cares for the families. In fact, the two were part of a coherent whole in a way. It's the same project of colonial governance. The British captain in charge of the deportation of the men in 1799 listed the families left destitute by the forced departure of their husbands, sons, and fathers. Louis Blanchette, an assistant surgeon, had left behind a mother aged and depending on him for support. François de Brande, a child, had left behind a child and a pregnant wife. Théodore Gardel and his sisters and children depended on him alone for subsistence, and the list went on and on. Grant later discovered that even men who he had previously listed as single were married with children. In fact, it was impossible to find anyone unconnected with local women and who hadn't left dependents on their bounty. To justify himself, Grant explained that most of these families were illegitimate. The parents were not married, and the women and children were, those are the terms he uses, black or half-caste. And his superiors were only too happy to accept this justification. The deportation of the men had been a blessing in disguise for their families. The men's departure gave them access to new sources of income. These families, he wrote, were perfectly happy at the event. In other words, the East India Company had relieved these women from the burden of their criminal husbands. Let's move forward a few years to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. In June 1817, the widow Lenormand wrote to the Governor General of the French establishments in India. Effacing herself behind a dead husband, she explained that she had delivered to the police of Pondicherry, where in 1817, French police, a heap of papers, so much paper that she had been, I quote, obliged to devote a part of her house to receive and keep them, and that she had taken great care for their preservation, which made it impossible for her to rent out her house and occupy a smaller and cheaper one. These papers were the registers, books, boxes, and effects belonging to the former colonial assembly of Pondicherry. That is to say, the whole archive of the French colonial assembly between its creation in 1790 and its dissolution in 1793. For 21 years, this archive would clutter up her living room. In 1924, Edmond Godard, retired governor of Pondicherry and one of its first historians, proudly remarked in the introduction of one of the volumes editing these documents that, I quote, "they are almost all originals or contemporary copies, all in a perfect state of conservation." He did not explain how these documents had survived. Historians don't always consider the contingencies that have led to the survival of the stuff they amorously peer at in reading rooms or straining their eyes on their computer screens. Yet a great deal of what we know about French India in this period is indebted to this woman. Louise is not just a witness to the story we as historians are telling. Without her, it could be argued that our work is impossible. This statement invites us to turn our questions on their head, instead of beginning with the knowledge that she so carefully preserved and forget about her, to write about political institutions, empires, wars, etc. It is possible to make her, to try at least, to make her the central object of the investigation. So why did Louise Dessenay, to call her by her own name, decide to sacrifice her comfort to save these documents? In 1796, these archives had been entrusted to her husband. A few months later, he was no longer with her, leaving her with two young daughters, aged 9 and 10, without resources and with a mountain of archives. Her husband was among those who had been deported to Europe. Louise had married Martin Le Normand in 1788. She was a native of Pondicherry, like her mother and grandmother. She was 15 when she married him, and an orphan. He was twice her age, and their two daughters were born by the time she was 17. In 1799, they are listed on the roll of the families of deportees drafted by Grant, in green, the East India Company captain. Le Normand, half-caste wife, and two children. Here as well, a name is hollowed out, hidden behind that of her husband. We don't know whether Martin ever managed to return from France. What we know is that by 1805 he was dead. Louise signed the marriage certificate of one of her daughters as Dessenay, widow Le Normand. We don't know how and when she found out about his death, but we can surmise the consequences this had on her family. And in June 1817, 18 years after the forced departure of her husband and sometime after the return of Pondicherry to France, Louise decided that time had come to claim compensation for her services to the public. For 2 decades, the remains of the broken empire lay side by side with this disjointed family. In her house, Louise lived surrounded with people and paper. One can almost picture her daughters sitting on the pile of archives, perhaps be warned by their mother to be careful. Why did Louise save these documents, years and years after her husband's disappearance? Had she pledged to him that she would keep everything in order in his absence? As Pondicherry was occupied by the British, did she keep this as a sense of duty for the French authorities? Or was it a form of life insurance, patiently waiting for the liberation of the city? This financial and legal savviness is perhaps one of the reasons why she never remarried. Whether she made the choice to stay put or whether her attempts to join her husband were impeded, she spent the rest of her life in Pondicherry. She died in 1861 in a house located northern Quartier Nord, I'm going to read it in French, Rue de Bassin de Richemont, number 6, at the venerable age of 88. So that's not the house, because most of the houses from that time don't exist anymore. But this is location. While the material remains of a long life have long disappeared, the documents Louise left behind her testify to her major curatorial role. Without her, this colonial archive would simply not exist. To briefly conclude, in zones of imperial entanglement, some of the same dynamics of disadvantage, inequality, and social welfare existed as in Europe, but they interacted in different ways. In the French Indian settlements, impulses towards charity, and social control built on previous experiments and were refined in new contexts towards new populations. We also see that men and women of various origins traversed relationships of dependence, and women leveraged their dependent position to improve their lot. Even when people died where they were born, like Louise, it doesn't mean that their lives were not lived on a vast scale. Pondicherry remained at the crossroads of empires. Wars were fought, regime changed, people came and went. During Louise's lifetime, the territory changed sovereignty 4 times and went through a succession of monarchies, republics, and empires. For most people, these political and military events were first and foremost experienced at the level of the family. Which leads me to wonder, was dislocation actually the norm rather than the exception? It seems, in fact, that the stable nuclear family was the exception. It also seems clear that women were routinely left to pick up the pieces of both work and care, and that marriage was no guarantor of stability. This was the cost of male adventuring. Thank you very much.
Yeah, come and sit down. How this works. Oh, it does work. It's on. It's on. Okay. Excellent. That was really terrific. I enjoyed that so much because, well, the subject matter is great, but also as a historian, I felt a bit of how you must have felt when you found these documents. Survival, and wow, I would like to ask you how you felt in that as you started to unravel this, because so much of history, because history is the recorded past, is about the gaps. We can find out certain things, but many things, many lives are lost to us forever, particularly the lives of women, also in this situation, women of color, their children, all these vulnerable people, we know nothing, and it's as though they've never been, but they have lived, of course. And when you find something, that is just amazing. So yeah, I really loved that. But I was also very aware that you cannot, as a historian, of course, go beyond your sources. So of course, that's your job. Some of you might know I'm also a novelist now as well as a historian. That's real fun. You could start filling in the gaps. I immediately wanted to start writing about some of the women who didn't fit into that kind of, where the respectable ones, where they're married. We have that line. There must have been so many and so many other lives and so many women who could not easily fit into that kind of narrative structure. So yeah, tell us how you felt when you found these things, and do you want to say anything about some of those women that you think have fallen through the cracks that we can't know about them?
Borrow your mic. Thank you very much. Yeah, so this question of the historian's emotion, it's interesting because this is something that different historians have different opinions about this. And I guess I've evolved also with the years. When I started writing history, historians were, at least the tradition I was educated in, which is a French social history tradition, the historian should never talk about themselves. God forbid, they should never be like anthropologists who talk constantly about themselves and their encounter with local people and indigenous populations. And now there's been, for 15 years, the growth of a whole field of study called the history of emotions, where historians study the emotions of people in the past. But there's also a trend at the moment for more and more historians who are interested in talking about how they relate to the past and how their own connection to the past and their own history even might influence how they read the past. So it's a difficult balance to strike. So talking about it is easier than writing about it, because the danger is navel gazing, and I don't think people came here to hear me talk about myself. They wanted to know about this. On the other hand, it's obviously fun and interesting to be a bit reflexive, and it's important as well to be aware of one's own prejudices, even, so how I felt, I guess, the first thing was I was delighted to be able to talk about people who I hadn't really written about in my previous research. And I was always aware that was a major problem. As I was increasingly interested in moving away from Europe, I was always doing social history, so I was less interested in the elite than in people from more popular backgrounds. I also thought I don't want to write a history of colonial elites only. You know, otherwise it's going to be yet again a history of powerful white men. So, for instance, I didn't. I moved on quickly, but at the beginning, you've got this image from the 19th. Oh, doesn't seem to want to go back. Okay, there was. Oh yeah, we'll see it. This one, Portrait des grands hommes, Femmes illustres et sujets mémorables de France. Great men. In fact, if you flick through this, there's very few women in there, and the women are all like, you know, queens and aristocrats. And so this is the kind of history of India, of French India, that if people know anything about French India, it's about Dupleix, the glorious, French officer who tried to fight the evil Brits during the 7 Years' War in the 1760s and was defeated, but at least he did his best. And after that, because France suffered a number of defeats, the erasure of the French Empire in Asia was complete, more or less, after the middle of the 18th century. And so people don't really talk about French India. But there is a whole continent or iceberg of people who have barely been considered. So when I found letters by women, and also not only, not women I was familiar with, and in fact not just so-called French women. There's a lot of, because this is the Institut Français, I didn't talk about Danish women today, for instance, and Dutch women, but I've also found petitions by them. So that was really exciting. And of course, as I tried to show, and your question on gaps and silences is spot on. One has to read these documents carefully because they are not just descriptions, like photographs of the person. They are actually curated in order to get elicit a certain kind of answer and something in return. But I think some of what they said was basically describing their life experiences. But this question of working with fragments and trying to work out the more complex whole that lies behind the teeny tiny bits of evidence that are in the archives is really exciting. There's there's big debate at the moment between among historians, especially coming from the US, and now it's all over the place in Britain especially, where what is the difference between history and fiction? Is there a difference? We think, of course, that there is. But in terms of writing, historians can learn a lot from fiction writers, for instance, the dramatization of the discovery or the way of using a certain kind of humor, the way in which you can use creative metaphors. On the other hand, you don't want to make up things, but you can imagine what things might have been like, as long as you say very clearly when you are imagining and when you've got evidence to sustain, to prove it. Very long answer, sorry.
Thank you very much for a wonderfully informative lecture. So my question is if you wanted to comment more on the, I suppose, day-to-day life of women placed in these sorts of positions of destitution. They say in the letters that they destitute by the departure of their husbands, the breadwinners, and so that's why they're applying to the company for a pension. But could you comment on what they might do with that pension, or what life might be like before that pension? Are there efforts, for instance, to engage in commerce? Do they describe sort of potentially failed business ventures? Or are they worried about transgressing like colonial gendered boundaries that might prohibit a woman of respectable classes from, trying to appear at the marketplace, that sort of thing?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So one problem, talking about the sources we have, they almost never talk about, those colonial archives don't talk about, usually they don't mention women, as you saw on the list, the names of the women don't appear, and their occupations are not mentioned. So you can't really use those sources, those kind of proto-censuses that are pretty good for furniture in that period for men. You can't, where who is a banker, a mercer, a teacher, a priest. You don't have this information for women. On the other hand, in their letters, they talk about their main their ways of bringing some income. The bias with these letters, as I mentioned, is that they will always emphasize their poverty and distress. So even if they have alternative sources of income, it's not in their interest to emphasize it. But one very common source, and this is something I had no idea about before starting to work on this, the most common source of income was to be lodgers, to rent out parts of their houses. Problem is that in a time of crisis like this, who needs, to stay in Pondicherry at a time where, a lot of the population has left the city. It is economically struggling. It's primarily a comptoir, so a commercial port, which also has a thriving silk industry in the 18th century. For the French market, but not only. And also it's a place where there's a lot of importations from China and from other parts of India and re-exportation. So, but at the time, this is very different at the time of the British occupation. So we've got a few descriptions by British observers, like Mount Norris that I mentioned earlier, who talks about the fact that basically it's a city of people who survive by relying on the money from the British government, and so I think my hunch is that the people who really work and provide them with food are Indians from surrounding villages, but I'm sorry I can't be more specific because I haven't found anything in the archives so far to be more, to give you a more detailed answer.
Thanks. That was so fascinating. Thank you. I really appreciated what you said about the petitions not just being top down, and that there being some kind of interaction, and the women offering prayers for the EIC officials. And I wondered if any of them kind of engaged with their position as racialized in their letters. Do they talk about that? Do they use that in their letters in any way? That was my question.
Yeah, that's the short answer is no. And I think for very good reasons. It wouldn't really be in their interest. I'm careful. I don't want to generalize because I don't have enough evidence, but the few letters I have from people like Maria da Costa, who's a topaz, it seems pretty clear that it is because she's definitely not categorized by this India company as European or as a descendant of European, to use a term that they used at the time. That is to say, her father was not a descendant of Europeans either, that she's granted a very small pension. And this, the example I gave, did I find others? There are other cases, actually, of topaz women who I know that because I look at the censuses or I have the answer by the East India Company, but they never underline their racial status. I mean, a bit of context might be useful here. So the consequences of the French Revolution in Pondicherry, French revolutionary political debates were very important and led to the people, the Topaz people in 1790 to say, well, we are of Portuguese descent. We are also, many of us are propertied. We are merchants. We live, we dress like Europeans. We might not have the same skin color as Europeans, but we basically should be granted the rights to vote for the elections and even try and be elected as representatives. And their request is first granted, and 6 months later, there's a new law that passes and that says Topaz people are not eligible. They can't vote either, whatever their level of property. By contrast, in fact, with Métis, so-called Métis people, who are whose father is of European descent, and that's the father that matters here, who are treated like French, like people who recently arrived from France. So in a way that explains why they would have to tread very carefully. The other thing to mention is that that's the French way of dealing with people of various origins. But the British, we know, I gave you the example of the deportation in 1799, but the racialization of local populations began even earlier, probably in the British colonies. So I think there was an awareness. And again, even if, I mean, what I'm trying to show, and I'm building on the work of colleagues here, is that there's been a long tendency to treat each empire in isolation. This is the story of the French Empire. This is not the history of the Brits. In fact, there's 100 kilometers or less. I mean, they are neighbors. And people, of course, come and go and move across empires. So they learn they very easily what happens next door. And also often the families they might have members in different places, in different empires. So I think that also explains why underlining one's racial status would have been probably quite risky.
Oh, hello. Fascinating talk. I'll ask a very quick question. It's a very inappropriate one because it's about men, not women. Those 600 men who were shipped out, did they come back?
Do you want to ask more questions?
Yeah, we might take a few. I think there's about
I'll tell you.
questions on this side. Wait, I'll go.
Oh, is this one?
There's two. Your hands both.
Okay. So when talking about the begging letters, you pointed out that there's a high degree of stereotype in these letters, that they make claims of merit and they offer deference and the transaction is familiar, and you can see it in lots of other kinds of begging letters like English paupers to the guardians. In which case the process of translation would be fairly simple, that there's a set of rituals which in French and English seem pretty much the same. But I wondered whether you thought, or whether there was any evidence of different languages of deference and claims of merit, and in which case the process of translation would be a bit more complicated. And especially since this is a culturally very different place from, say, the English countryside or even the French countryside. I suppose this is partly a question about whether you can look at the French text and the English text and tell us what's going on in that transliteration.
Here, I'll take it. I'll take one more question.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. I wanted to ask about strategies, family strategies. You talked about quite a few times, and I wonder about a slippage between what women are trying to achieve in specific situations and a kind of more coherent family strategy. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about disagreements. So you mentioned that case where you've got multiple people who are all claiming, to inherit the same pension, for instance. But are there examples where this idea that husbands are kind of leaving for the good of their wives, they're going off so their wife can claim a pension? I can imagine that might be quite a discussion around the kitchen table, if you like, to come to that kind of solution, because it seems quite drastic. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the first question about men, I tracked them down. So that's one chapter. It's more than one chapter, but there's one chapter on the ship, the itinerary of the ship that moves from Pondicherry to the Cape, then St. Helena, then Portsmouth. So some people actually petitioned on board the ship, and their letters were then sent to the British authorities from the Cape, from St. Helena, from Portsmouth. There's also a printed pamphlet of about 20 pages long, written by the passengers of this ship, the civilians of Pondicherry, appealing against their deportation, which they thought was against the laws of war, against the law of nations, the international law at the time, because these people were civilians. They were not supposed to be punished for the attitude of their country. Some of them stayed in the Cape, actually, a few of them, and died there. But the majority went to France, and they tried to get basically funding from the French government to fund their trip to India, back to India. I have found people with the same name. So we've talked about sources earlier. I use a lot of those registers, parish registers, birth, marriage, and death certificates, because the colonial archives, French colonial archives, are amazing. They're available online. So if you have family from this part of the world, but for instance, on Pondicherry, this is really great, on the Réunion as well, and Mauritius. And so, but so far, I'm disappointed to say that I don't think any of these guys made it back to Pondicherry. But hopefully, I will. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a definite no, but at the moment, I haven't found any evidence that they managed to come back 17 years later. As for the question by Peter on translation, that's a great question. That's also a very tricky question, because I don't usually, I only have the English version of the letter. The good thing is that I know who the translators were often, which is not often the case. So the East India Company, people who spoke other languages. So I guess were you thinking about letters also by non-European in non-European languages? So there's a great scholarship on India in particular, for instance, by many historians working on the role of specific Indian intermediaries who managed to speak multiple languages, not just multiple Indian languages, but also European languages. So their mediation was key in this process. In my case, so far I've been able to locate the original. So that's a little frustrating not to be able to tell you more about that. But I take your point about the fact that the context is different from Europe. But in my view, so while the women, as I said, the majority, about 3/4 of the women were born in India, most of the men, same proportion, were coming from France. So they would have been exposed to these practices. They would perhaps have learned the kind of rhetorical tropes that one needs to use in order to be heard. But I can't go any further. And that leads us to the question about potential conflicts in terms of trying to access the same pot of money, more or less. Is it what we're alluding to? Yeah. Well, so there are legal cases, not necessarily to do with the pensions, but after the war. Louise Dessonnet, there's very little I'll tell you something. It's also connected to emotions in a way, because there's very little stuff about her that I found. There is this letter, and there's like 3 cases in the archives. I can't remember which. I'm really ashamed, but French colonial archives from before the British occupation and after the British occupation. So that's where I saw that she needed a tutor and an exemption in order to be able to marry at 15. Both her parents were dead. But after I was going to say liberation of Pondicherry, because I'm still a French patriot. This is the Institut Français. After Pondicherry became French again, she was involved in 2 cases and condemned actually because she didn't pay what she owed some guy. It had to do with rent and property, but which changed my. I mean, it's interesting because when you only have so-called judicial archives to work on, we have to be careful with that too, because by definition, these archives will paint people in a certain light. Oh yeah, well, she's a criminal. Oh, she's a cheat. Oh, she tried to take money from this person or that person. Well, that's the nature of criminal archives. So I don't know, but what I know is that she conflicted. She went into. She had a serious dissension with the family of a former husband to try and claim the inheritance. So that's one example. I'm sure there were many, many more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll go straight to the question. Are the archives open, and are they in an open access sort of source for both French and English? And how did the society change in England and in France with men leaving, sort of going abroad? Did that help the women to then think about their rights or do other jobs or think about following them? It's usually the men who leave or young leave first, and then the girls or the females follow them to set up a family in a new environment and things like that.
Yes, thank you very much. So first question, yes, of course they are. So the archives are open. So as I mentioned, these petitions are in the British Library, in the, is it called Asia and Africa room now? It's in the archives of the East India Company. And as long as you have a British Library card, but I think anyone can have one, and it's free. And the French ones are in Aix-en-Provence, a lovely city. It's a good time of the year to visit it when you need a bit of sun. And it's a bit more difficult because it's France, but it's not, you don't have to pay, but you need to book a place well in advance. And so these archives are there. They're a bit more difficult to locate because they're not as well catalogued on site. But I mean, I could tell you more separately if you like. That question is very important. So about, in a way, what I was trying to address, if I speak like as an academic historian, is the disparity of treatment of men and women when people are interested in migration, with this kind of cliche that migration history is men's history because women don't move, or if they move across very short distances. And historians of work in particular, and people working on economic migrations, have shown that in the early modern world, in particular in Europe, but elsewhere as well, women moved an awful lot, including across large distances. For instance, poor women moved very commonly to look for resources very far away from home. And so it's difficult to generalize, but if you were asking about, for instance, the places where these men who moved to French India came from, so many of them came from Western France, and especially Lorient. Lorient, in southern Brittany, in Morbihan, the name comes from the Orient. That's where the word means in French, right? L' or Orient. That's the original spelling. And then now it's spelled without the apostrophe. Many of these people came from there. So, and that's quite characteristic of the population of ports, where there's a lot of sailors and mobile populations. And so most of the men came from there. So in the port, you have more men than women. But in India, you have way more European men than European women. And so there is this kind of demographic imbalance that leads necessarily to mixed relationships. So that's common. That's not just specific to France, by the way. That's common with every other empire. It's the same with the Portuguese, the British, or the Danish. The main difference is that every empire doesn't see these what is sometimes called mixed race unions in the same way. So in some places, like the Portuguese and the Spanish, religion is the key factor for them. So as long as people are converted, and the French actually, they are increasingly underline this. Like if women are Catholic, it doesn't matter so much that they're Indian. That's the case in the 18th century, and then towards the end of the 18th century, there's a tendency to say, well, actually, converted or not, we don't really want these unions that will lead to, I don't want to end on that note, to, you know where I'm going, like to a mixed bloods and terrible terms like this. I'll stop here.
Well, I have a final question since I have the mic. And before we leave, I mean, these women, it's so hard to see them still. I mean, you found these stories, but it's so hard to see them because the texts are translated, because they've got these translators who, whether because of their own, Christian beliefs or because of the translators, it seems to be these codes, which are these codes of deference, which are just everywhere. And it's kind of hard to see who they really are, what they're really doing. But you have this one example. Was it Louisa who goes to Madras? Or Maria who goes to Madras, and her request is rejected. And what she did seems to kind of transgress the expectations of her charitable request, that she didn't stay in her place, and she actually moved, and she made herself very visible. And I wonder to what extent that's a really interesting example of a challenge of the gendered dynamics that are present within these female requests towards, British benevolence. And yeah, I don't know if...
You're absolutely right. And that leads also to the problem of the conservation of the archives. I mentioned 200 memorials, you remember, from people claiming those pensions. Those memorials were not kept. And the British magistrate in Pondicherry says, I've selected among them, together with the French Catholic clergy in Pondicherry, only those who are respectable and eligible according to our principles, having a respectable profession, having a sufficient number of children, being married. And of course, one could surmise that being of European descent would be a big plus for them. So finding someone like Maria was great, but I would hope that I would be careful not to present her necessarily just as an exception. I think she might be more typical of a...
She's like a window into something that we can see more difficilement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Renaud.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renaud, and thank you, Marisa, for chairing this session and for everyone for being here. And a final big thank you to the Institute, to the French Institute, to Patrick and Christelle and Natalie and the tech team who've made this possible. We're really grateful to have this space every year, this beautiful space, and there's wonderful canapes and drinks in the salons afterwards, behind the bookcase. And you always make us feel so welcome. And it's so important in this time to kind of celebrate great academic work in the arts and humanities and social sciences as we do tonight. So thanks again for everyone.